Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ben Tomczyk on behalf of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. We are really excited to have you for this webinar. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping items we wanted to share. We are recording this webinar for future use and live streaming it over Facebook. Additionally, we really do hope to make this webinar as conversational as possible. We know there's a lot of interest in this topic. And so what we're going to ask folks is if you have questions, you can submit them using the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Now, to kind of help level set us for today's webinar, I'm sure it's not escaped anyone's attention. We have an election going on, and next month, Americans will go to the polls to elect a president. Regardless of who wins and who is sworn in on January 20th, 2021, there are some fiscal challenges that will await the president. In addition to that, we know that the two leading contenders, President Donald Trump and Vice President Joe Biden, both have put forth ambitious proposals for what they would do if elected. To help us dig through those proposals, what the cost is, what it means to the fiscal health of the country, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mark Goldwine. Mark is the Senior Director or Senior Vice President of Policy at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And him and his team have been spearheading our U.S. Budget Watch 2020 initiative, which aims to bring transparency and accountability to the presidential race. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. And Mark, I know you're going to dive deep into the report, but I think it'd be really interesting if you could kind of tell folks at home how this report came together.
Sure, Ben. Thank you very much. Would you mind granting me screen sharing capabilities so I can share my slide deck?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm so excited to be able to share this report. I'm sure many of you have read it in full already. It's only like 30 pages, no big deal. But this report really is, and I apologize, whenever I do my screen share, you'll have done it with me, you know that it freezes for the first 3 minutes of it. So that's a good chance for me to kind of talk about where we are with things. But this report has been a long time in the making. We, as part of our U.S. Budget Watch, I'm sorry, let me back up. We've been following presidential campaigns since I've been working at CRFB. Since 2008, at least, we have followed and analyzed every presidential campaign. We looked at Obama versus Clinton and Obama versus McCain, all the way up to president. And we start these early in the primaries. So many of you may have seen that this time during the primaries, we had several analyses that focused on plans of then candidate Harris and Senator Sanders, and comparing Sanders and Buttigieg and Warren to Biden on healthcare and on other issues. And this is a lot of work to try to estimate what is ultimately relatively vague promises relative to the realities of legislation or even a president's budget. I do want to recognize my team, especially John Schuler on my team, who has been the lead on this project, but also Tyler Evilsizer and Adam Rosenberg. They have done an incredible amount of work culling through the websites of each of the candidates, identifying every single thing that could possibly be a policy, trying to figure out what that means, because often we get different levels of detail, and then looking for credible scores of either that policy or a similar policy that we can peg off of in order to come up with this comprehensive analysis. Now, we focused obviously on the two major candidates for president, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And our goal is not to figure out everything that the person wants to do based on their speeches or based on their, what they've done as president or anything like that. Our goal was to look at what their campaign plan is. And for Joe Biden, that started with the 48 distinct plans on his website, joebiden.com. And we went through each of those plans, some of them tens and dozens and dozens of pages long. And we identified 800 different policy proposals. From there, we tried to figure out which proposals have a fiscal impact. And from there, we tried to figure out which ones were meaningful in terms of size. And then we kind of lumped them together. What we found is Joe Biden has a lot of proposals, but the biggest ones involve expanding access and affordability of childcare, preschool, K through 12 education, and higher education. This is everything from universal preschool to a much expanded childcare tax credit to more money for Title I spending in elementary and high school education to student loan forgiveness and free college in some cases, or affordable college in other cases. He would increase spending on healthcare, mainly by expanding Obamacare substantially, new subsidies, larger Medicaid, a public option, and by creating new elder care and long-term care spending and tax credit programs. He would invest heavily in green infrastructure and other technologies. This includes research and development, it includes building roads and bridges, it includes building new housing. It includes R&D, it includes government procurement of especially American-made goods. He would increase Social Security and SSI benefits. He would increase taxes, especially on corporations, pretty significantly on corporations, investors, and high-income households. He would reduce prescription drug costs, and he would end the engagements in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Now, these bullets don't say everything that Joe Biden would do, but these are the bigger elements that we focused on analyzing. Although you'll see in our analysis, we really did try to include everything that we thought would have a meaningful fiscal cost, a cost over, say, $10 billion over 10 years, $1 billion a year. Now, unfortunately, President Trump did not have the same level of detail on his website. President Trump does release a budget every year as required by law, and those budgets are very detailed. But our goal here wasn't to find out what is the White House's plan, what is OMB's plan. Our goal is to find out what is President Trump's plan for his next 4 years in office, assuming he wins. And we basically were able to identify two parts of his website that included the makings of an agenda. First, there was a 54 bullet point agenda that he called sort of his agenda for the second term. These bullet points were relatively vague. Not all of them were fiscally related, but they gave us a lot of clues as to what he was supporting. And they gave us enough clues that we could go off of those bullets and then look to see what they meant by looking at proposals in his budget, by looking at speeches, by looking at what some of his allies have proposed or legislation with similar names. And so we used those bullets as a jumping off point and then looked elsewhere to find the details. In addition, the president released what he called a platinum plan for Black Americans. Now, a lot of this plan was repeating elements of the 54 bullets, but explaining why they could help African American households. But some of it was new policies, and so we incorporated those new policies as well. Overall, we know that the president's agenda includes lower taxes for individuals, tax incentives for domestic investment in manufacturing, more infrastructure spending, expanded space travel, and that's including the Space Force, but also a mission to Mars and a base on the moon, more money for the military and for veterans, lower prescription drug costs, and like Biden, ending the engagements in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Now, for each of these plans, once we identified the policies, we need to figure out how much they cost. And it's not always obvious for at least two reasons. First of all, the same exact policy could cost different amounts depending on what kind of model you use, depending on how you estimate it. These are all estimates. And so the same exact policy, one group could think cost $300 billion and another group could think cost $500 billion. So that causes some uncertainty. But in addition, even Joe Biden's plans, which are very, very detailed, are not at the level of legislation. They're not at the level of what you would see in, say, a president's budget. And so there's some ambiguity as to what the policy itself is. And so what we do is we construct a low, central, and high estimate based on the various estimates, based on the various interpretations of the policy, and then also kind of based on how much benefit of the doubt we want to give. So in our low cost estimate, if the campaign put out a number, we generally accepted it as a reasonable, we generally accepted in our low cost estimate, even if we thought that number was probably wrong. Or if there was another number out there from a credible estimator, again, even if our estimate showed something very, very different, we would put that in the low cost estimate. Now I want to level set us before I get into the results, and I know that's what you've all been waiting for, but debt just exceeded the size of the economy. By our estimates, debt is now 102% of GDP. It has never been as large as the economy in our entire history, other than for a couple of years around World War II. Our previous record is 106. That was immediately after World War II, and we then had a plan to bring it down. Debt this year thanks in part to the COVID crisis, but also the fiscal irresponsibility over the last 5 years, the Great Recession before that, and other issues dating back before that, along with the growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Debt is growing quite high, and it's getting there faster than we previously thought. A year ago, we thought that debt would exceed the size of the economy in the early 2030s. We're now there. And even under current law, we expect, according to CBO, for debt to be 109% of GDP by the end of the decade. That would be a new record, higher than any time in the United States' entire history. Now, both candidates, we believe, would take this debt situation and would make it worse. Under current law, we are projected to borrow about $13 trillion. In other words, to run deficits of $13 trillion over the next decade. Our best estimates of the Biden-Trump plans suggest that they will increase that to something like 18 or 19 trillion. Under our central estimate, the Trump plan would increase deficits over the next decade by 4.95 trillion, almost $5 trillion. The Biden plan would cost just a bit more, 5.6 trillion. Now, as I mentioned, we do have a high and low cost scenario. Under the low cost scenario, both plans are pretty close to neutral. The president's plan would cost about 700 billion. The former vice president's plan would save about 150 billion. These are really benefit of the doubt scenarios that take numbers that we don't think are realistic. So I wouldn't put this in the bank, but this can tell you that maybe the candidates are intending to be close to budget neutral, which, remember, still means debt at record highs. But the reality, we think, most likely is that they're going to add 5 trillion or more to the debt. And under a high cost scenario, President Trump would add almost $7 trillion to the debt, and Vice President Biden over 8 trillion. These are expensive plans. In previous election cycles, we've typically seen numbers that are in the hundreds of billions. Last time around, we did see President Trump's plan would add $5.4 trillion to the debt, or something around that. So President Trump, in a sense, is doubling down on his first agenda, most of which he passed. But by and large, these are unusually large numbers. And they come about, by the way, in very different ways. President Trump spends and cuts taxes by a little bit over $5 trillion and has a little bit of offsets. Whereas President Biden spends a lot of money, Vice President Biden, spends a lot of money, but has more offsets. So they arrive to the numbers in different ways. The Biden plan is very big spending, pretty big taxes. The Trump plan is pretty big tax cuts, pretty big spending. But they both get to around the same place under our central estimate. I should also mention, we are not including any of their plans for COVID relief in this. We're just looking at their steady state policies. And we did a separate calculation that removes the policies that would just be one-time spending, like infrastructure. And even if you don't count that one-time spending like infrastructure, both plans would still add something like 2.4 trillion to the debt. Now, as I mentioned, the table you see here compares the plans under our central estimate. Both spend more on childcare and education, but Biden much more so. Biden spends more on healthcare, whereas Trump would save money. Biden spends more to expand Social Security and Medicare. Both spend more on infrastructure. Again, Biden more so than Trump. Trump spends more on national security on net, whereas Biden actually saves money. Trump cuts taxes, whereas Biden increases taxes, and both would result in higher interest payments. And you can see in this next slide, under our low and central estimates, the numbers are different, but still a lot of spending in both scenarios. Now, to dive a little bit deeper, as I mentioned, we looked through the Trump bullet points, and here's what we identified. He wants universal school choice and increased access to childcare and preschool. We don't have the exact details on this, but based on a number of assumptions, we think this is most likely to cost about $150 billion. On the other hand, in the healthcare space, he wants to save about that much. He calls for cutting prescription drug prices and ending surprise billing, which, if you assume what's in his budget, would save about $150 billion. He also calls for some broader healthcare system healthcare system changes, but there's really not enough detail for us to come up with a constructive number. We look to his budget, and his budget doesn't have enough detail. So in our low estimate, we assumed what they assumed in their budget. In our central estimate, we assumed 0, which is what CBO discerns from their budget. The big spending, though, for Trump is $2 trillion more of infrastructure. In his bullets, he says more infrastructure. He's tweeted he wants $2 trillion. 650 billion by our estimates for the missions to Mars, the Moon, and the Space Force, and another 500 billion for national defense, as well as 400 billion for veterans. He does want to save some money by ending the war in Afghanistan and foreign engagements and cutting benefits to illegal immigrants. But as I mentioned, still overall, spending is increased. And on top of that, he wants to cut taxes. And while we don't know exactly how much he wants to cut taxes, at minimum, we expect he wants to extend the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That would be 1.25 trillion just for the individual provisions. We know he wants to expand opportunity zones and have new kinds of manufacturing tax credits. And we know he wants to do expensing for essential industries, which again, we assume means at least continuing the expensing that is currently in place. That gets us, when we add this all up, to a net cost of about $5 trillion. Biden's plan, as I said, is much more expensive, but has many more pay-fors. The Biden plan would spend, by our estimates, about $2.7 trillion on childcare and education. Over $1.5 trillion on higher ed alone, from loan forgiveness for anyone that's in public, went to public schools, for other ways of restructuring loans, for subsidizing new schooling. And then on top of that, we estimate about 600 billion for K-12 education and another $500 billion for universal pre-K, as well as very strong childcare support. In the healthcare space, as I mentioned, the Biden plan would lower the Medicare age from 65 to 60, but significantly expand the Affordable Care Act, including larger subsidies, more and a public option that people are auto-enrolled into. I apologize for that noise. My 3-year-old is screaming quite loud. But he would also support more spending on elder care and long-term care, as well as funding for rural health, mental health, opioid crisis. This is all very expensive. Some of it would be offset by his plan to negotiate more drug prices and set more drug prices, but overall, we're still about $2 trillion in healthcare. On top of that, we estimate that he's got about $1 trillion, $1.1 trillion from expanding Social Security and SSI, including that his plan would say that supplemental security income would have to have a minimum benefit of the poverty level, which means we'd have to roughly double spending on SSI. And then the vice president, an area that I think is pretty ambiguous in his website, calls for substantial investment in infrastructure, green technology, research and development, housing and education, infrastructure, build schools, build houses, and procurement. It's very hard for us to understand from his website how much of this is the same policies being described in different ways and how much is different policies. So we think this is going to be somewhere between $2 trillion and $4 trillion, depending on how much overlap there is. We assume in our central estimate 3 trillion, but there is a lot of uncertainty. Add to that his plan for affordable housing, universal paid leave, et cetera. We're talking about $4.5 trillion of other domestic spending. Now, there are offsets in the Biden plan, substantial offsets. We estimate about 750 billion from ending the wars in immigration, but most significantly, he would substantially increase taxes. The corporate rate would go from 21 to 28, which is about halfway back to where it was before, but there'd also be an international and domestic corporate minimum tax and other corporate tax increases. That would mean essentially we would increase corporate taxes to significantly above where they were under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The top individual rate would go back to 39.6. In addition, capital gains would be taxed as ordinary income at high levels and be taxed at death. Biden would eliminate the Social Security tax max above $400,000 and have a bunch of other tax increases that up to something like $4 trillion. Again, when we add this all up, he gets to about 5.6 trillion in our base estimate. That's the sum of about 11 trillion of new spending and tax cuts, offset by almost 6 trillion of savings, and then some additional interest costs. So what would this all mean for the debt? As I mentioned, under current law, we are already heading for a record high debt of 109% of GDP. Under the Trump plan, we project that even if everything else stays as is, Just enacting the Trump plan would mean that debt would rise to 125% of GDP, 125% in 2030, and rising rapidly, as you can see. Under the Biden plan, we estimate debt would be even higher at 128% of GDP and rising still maybe a little bit slower, but still quite quickly. If you add in these ranges, it's possible the situation is somewhat better. Under best case scenario, the Biden plan is at 108%, just below current law. But it's also possible the situation could be much worse, and we could be seeing debt in the 130s, high 130s by the end of the decade. So overall, what does this mean? It means these folks are making a lot of promises that would be very expensive if additional pay-fors are not mentioned. There are differences between the candidates. There's some differences between how much we think they would add to the debt. Biden, we think, would add a bit more. There's a lot more differences in how they would get there. As I mentioned, Biden supports much more spending with more taxes. Trump supports both more spending and more tax cuts, but with fewer offsets overall. There is a lot of uncertainty, and we do welcome and hope for more information from the campaigns, but whoever is president is going to have to wrestle with the fact that their campaign agenda is very expensive, and we're hopeful, organizationally, that when it's time to put forward the next president's budget, these policies are right-sized and/or more offsets are identified so that we don't continue on this upward debt trajectory indefinitely. And if you want to read more, please visit crfb.org. You can go right to our US Budget Watch website, US Budget Watch, USBW 2020, or US-Budget Watch-2020, or just go to the front page of our website and you can see the detailed paper, which my team worked really hard on, and I'm sure they'd love to see you reading all the minutiae details of what these candidates have proposed. So Ben, at this point, I would love to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Mark. I have to start what I think is an obvious question. Someone wrote in, they said, is your 3-year-old screaming because we're blowing her future with this? So,
my 3-year-old has known for some time. I remind her every couple of months that Social Security is going to run out before her 18th birthday, so she better start saving now. But yeah, this doesn't make her any happier.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, we encourage you, if you want to go read the report, I just included a link to it in the chat feature. We already have a ton of questions. Mark, let me start with what I think is on a lot of people's minds. We've had a presidential debate and a vice presidential debate. The topic of our nation's fiscal future has not been brought up. So for folks joining today with less than a month till we all go to the polls, what should they be asking candidates for the House, the Senate, the presidency? What should they be doing to help raise this? And what should they want to hear from candidates?
Look, so I'm not a political guy, I'm a policy guy, but I get the politics of proposing deficit reduction is hard. The politics of saying we are going to increase taxes or cut spending just for the sake of helping our future is sometimes tough. But I do think we could at least expect candidates to put forward ways to pay for their own plans. And if they can't do that, I think a very minimum standard is a commitment to pay for their plans. And so I would ask candidates, do you commit that you are going to offset any tax cut or any spending increase that you put forward? And then second, I would ask, given that Social Security, Medicare, and the highway trust funds are all going to run out in the next 11 years or so, do you commit to working towards a plan to save those trust funds before it's too late? And I think regardless of the details of these candidates' plans, we should all agree that we should be offsetting new spending or new tax cuts, and we should all agree that we need to save Social Security, Medicare, and the highway fund.
Mark, let me start with the first question we have from Ed. His question is about Vice President Biden's agenda. He says, Vice President Biden has said that he would only do tax increases for those with incomes over $4K. What would the effect of that be?
So we estimate that, let me back up. Pretty much all of Biden's tax increases either are for corporations, banks, or households above $400,000 of income. So he has kept this promise. That does not mean that they're the ones that will be affected. If you raise taxes on corporations, it can affect people below 400,000. But in terms of direct taxation, Vice President Biden has only proposed taxes on those over 400,000. That's pretty limiting in how much money you can raise. So the Vice President, I think, has a pretty aggressive plan, but it only raises enough to pay for half of his agenda. I think it'd be pretty difficult to identify enough revenue from that group to finance the other half of the agenda, which leaves three choices. Either the debt's got to be higher, the agenda's got to be smaller, or some of the revenue is going to have to come from folks making less than $400,000 a year. And I'm interested to see, when push comes to shove, which of those sort of three inconsistent things break. Because we can't have $11 trillion of new spending, no new debt, and taxes only on the very, very rich.
John writes in, any thoughts on how budgets might shift if a new stimulus bill is passed?
We intentionally, in this analysis, only looked at sort of what we thought were their steady state plans. So we ignored COVID relief. We're going to do a separate analysis that focuses on their COVID plans. Now, I do think there still is some interactions with COVID plans. I mean, that Vice President Biden had planned to do this $2 trillion of green spending either way. But in light of COVID, he's now proposed doing it in 4 years instead of 10 years. So it's a little bit faster. On the flip side, it's possible that some of the a stimulus bill could remove the need to do some of these permanent things. For example, if it included some loan forgiveness or some tax breaks. But by and large, I do think these things move separately. And the agendas we looked at are, what are their agendas for kind of the medium and long-term future, not what is their agenda for 2021.
Mark, you mentioned earlier on the webinar that this is not the first time CRFB has done a report like this. In 2016, CRFB did promises and price tags. Ricardo writes in and says, any sense from prior analyses how different campaign promises pan out in reality after elections?
I'm sure Ricardo's not you, Ben, because that's just a perfect setup to mention the previous paper we wrote, which is that we've written a number of papers under US Budget Watch, not just this final paper. But the most recent paper we wrote was how President Trump's campaign promises compared in 2016 compared to what he actually did. And what we found, interestingly, was he did pretty much what he said he was going to do. Not exactly, but during the 2016 campaign, President Trump said he was going to spend or cut taxes by a combined roughly $4.5 trillion. And what he actually did was spend and cut taxes by a combined $3.9 trillion. That's without counting the COVID stuff, without the coronavirus relief stuff. His tax cuts were a little bit less than he promised. His veterans increases were about. His non-defense increases were actually opposite of what he had proposed in 2016. He said cut, and he actually increased. But overall, President Trump pretty much signed into law and executive order what he said he would. Now, that's not necessarily sustainable to do over and over and over again, because if we keep adding $4 trillion to the debt with every new presidential administration, we're going to get to the point of ridiculum sooner or later. And so my hope is that, well, I don't want these candidates to break any promises. My hope is that when they come to governing, they figure out how to deliver these promises in a way that is both cheaper and more paid for.
I want to go back. We have a bunch of questions regarding Vice President Biden's tax plan. One person writes in, does this mean that Biden will raise taxes on middle-income Americans? And then we have a second question. Do Biden's changes to capital gains taxes apply to lower-income taxpayers?
Vice President Biden has said clearly he is not intending to raise taxes on any household below $400,000. That includes for capital gains. Now, as I mentioned, there's a disparity because there's 11 trillion of spending. There's only 5 trillion of tax increases. So if the vice president wins and wants to enact his agenda, he will have to choose. Do I want to scale down my spending? Do I want to scale up my taxes, or do I want to borrow? And I do think that if scale up the taxes becomes an option, it would be foolish to not at least look at taxes for, say, a household only making $200,000 a year, or a household making $100,000 a year. Those are still quite well off households relative to relative to the average. So I do think that if we want to have an agenda of the spending side in the Biden's budget, we will have to look at middle class taxes. But the vice president has been clear that he does not want to do that, and none of his plans so far would raise taxes in the middle class.
Thanks, Mark. And I know we said we'd keep this call to a half hour or webinar to a half hour, but we have a ton of questions and we're going to keep going because I know there's a lot of interest. Fred writes in, he says, I don't understand how President Trump's plan will work. Increase spending with less incomes from taxes. How can his deficit be lower? Can you explain that?
Sure. So President Trump's deficit is not lower than today. It's almost 5 trillion higher today. It's lower than Biden marginally. And the reason it's lower is that while he supports both spending increases and tax cuts, those are smaller than Biden's spending increases combined, significantly smaller. And so Biden supports 11 trillion of spending increases essentially that are half offset. Donald Trump supports about 6 trillion of spending increases and tax cuts, but only a small fraction of that is offset. And so as a result, both would increase the debt substantially, but in different ways. I wouldn't get too worked up about the differences between them. It's relatively, we used to think $600 billion was a lot of money, and it very much is. But in the scheme of how big these agendas are, it's not impossible that actually Trump's plan would cost a bit more than Biden's, or that Biden's plan would cost even more than Trump's than we think. In our central estimate, the Biden plan would cost about 10% more, but both plans would be adding 5 trillion-ish to the debt.
Mark, Robert writes in, what are your assumptions as to economic growth under both plans? And then let me add a second question on to Jason, who said, regarding both plans, to what extent are these dynamic estimates?
So these are both great questions. So the estimates as we've done them are mainly done on what's called a conventional basis, which means they would account for behavioral reactions to the policy changes, but they don't account for big changes to the macroeconomy, like changes in the employment rate. There's a few exceptions. Immigration, we do some dynamic scoring. There are some things where we are not able to predict behavior, and so we do pure static scoring. But these are largely done with conventional scoring that includes behavior. And so our growth assumptions are the same as the Congressional Budget Office, which is that after a very, very bad 2020, the economy is going to grow a little bit over 2% a year for the rest of the decade, and slower than that once the economy has recovered. Now, in reality, the economy is likely to grow either faster or slower depending on these plans. I don't think that over 10 years, the difference is likely to be large. In the near term, the more deficit spending can help get us to recovery faster. But over the long term, there's offsetting effects in both these plans. On the one hand, President Trump's plan would grow the economy through lower tax rates and through more infrastructure spending. On the other hand, it would shrink the economy through higher debt and less immigration. On the one hand, Vice President Biden's plans would grow the economy with more infrastructure investment, with more research, with more spending on some kinds of education. On the other hand, and with more immigration, on the other hand, it would shrink the economy, both due to more debt and higher tax rates. And so on net, I expect there to be effects, but not pretty large. And to give you some sense of what this would do to our numbers, even if the candidates, even if one of the candidates' plans grew the economy 0.5% per year faster, in other words, the economy was 5% larger after a decade, and that's way outside any estimate. So that's like huge. It would only make about $1 trillion difference in our total estimates. The economic growth is not going to be that large for our overall estimates, even if we are off by a pretty significant amount. And based on other estimates out there, I don't expect either candidate is going to move the growth needle dramatically over the long run.
Thanks. And just a reminder before we get to more questions, I just put a link in the chat to the full report. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. I want to go, Jamie has writes in, and I'm going to add an addendum after this question. She says, how can we make investments in clean energy future without raising taxes and increasing the national debt? And I would say, Mark, you could also, I'm sure people have the same question about how do we do infrastructure without adding to the national debt? how do we tackle a litany of problems without adding to the national debt?
Right. So I think there's three ways to accomplish your goals without adding to the debt, and I would suggest doing all of them. One is to spend efficiently. Okay, so we can spend more on infrastructure, and there's a lot of economic reasons we should, but we can spend on smart infrastructure, and we can even get more bang for our dollar for our existing infrastructure spending. We can find a way to both target to better spending and to spend more efficiently, get better costs. That's number one, spend your dollars efficiently. Number two, you can cut other spending. So we could spend more on infrastructure by spending less on healthcare, for example. We spend, as a nation, twice as much on healthcare as our average OECD, compadres, the average OECD country. We spend 50% more than the next largest country. There's plenty of ways that we can reduce healthcare costs that would leave more room for infrastructure or for whatever your initiative. And option number three is you can raise taxes, and you can raise taxes efficiently. For example, we could, if what you really want is green infrastructure, you could fund $1 trillion of green infrastructure with a relatively modest, still big, but relatively modest carbon tax. A carbon tax of the size that CBO and others have looked at would raise $1 trillion. That would give you a 1-2-3 punch, right? Because the carbon tax would help move us towards more green technology. The green infrastructure will move toward more green technology, and you wouldn't add to the debt. So I don't really buy these arguments. Well, we can't figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't add to the debt. There's always a way where there's a will. It just involves making some tough choices.
Mark, you had mentioned earlier the plan does not include COVID-related costs. And we had a question from Raj who writes in, could you talk about the COVID-related costs each candidate has?
Yeah, so to be frank with you, Raj, and thank you for your question, I've been so steeped in the rest of their plans that I couldn't do justice to their COVID plans. I can tell you broadly that Vice President Biden has generally been supportive of the approach that the House has been taking, a lot of big relief. He also has some specific plans to reform unemployment benefits, to do more to subsidize people that go back to work. President Trump has, as we can see from Twitter, he supports payroll tax holiday and forgiving the existing payroll tax deferral. He wants to send people more checks. He's talked about more money for schools, to allow schools to reopen, and more money possibly bring some of the infrastructure into COVID relief. But we are working on a comprehensive comparison that will compare the candidates. And it's possible some of that will become moot if there's some kind of deal for further COVID relief in the next few weeks.
Mark, we have a question from Rick. Interest rates are low right now. If interest rates return to their normal range, and he says, i.e. 3%, what would be the budgetary impact on all this?
It would be very expensive. I mean, we do expect interest rates are going to stay low for quite a while. The Federal Reserve has given forward guidance to say as much. We also do expect interest rates are going to actually rise by 3% over time, but pretty gradually. If it happens quicker, it could make this bad budget situation much worse. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think that if the interest rate was about 1% higher each year, debt would be about $2 trillion higher after a decade. And someone on my policy team will scream at me right now if I'm way off on that. But higher interest rates can make everything worse. And the thing about borrowing at very high debt levels is a small change in your interest rate can very quickly change the cost of financing your debt. Interest rates change a lot faster than debt does, which is why one of the reasons we argue for getting debt down in good times, so that you're not so subject to the consequences of interest rate risk.
Mark, we have a couple of questions about President Trump's healthcare plan and what effect that may have, especially since a big part of his 2016 plan was to repeal and replace Obamacare.
So I have a lot of questions about President Trump's healthcare plan as well, and so I appreciate you asking. What we have is a pretty vague bullets. We know that he wants to lower prescription drug costs, And so we assume that means something like what's in his budget, which is to reform the Medicare Part D formula and kind of cap inflation growth. We know he wants to address surprise billing, this issue where basically you go in to the hospital or to a doctor thinking that they're covered by your insurance, and they bring in another doctor, like an anesthesiologist that isn't covered. And so surprise, you're stuck with the extra bill. We know he wants to do those things. Beyond that, what he said is that he wants to put patients and doctors back in charge of healthcare. He wants to lower premiums. He wants to cover pre-existing conditions. But we don't really know exactly what that means. And we tried to look to his budget, thinking, well, okay, the budget can give us some clues. But the president's vision for health reform, his budget, is almost as vague as these bullet points. They estimate it's going to save around $850 billion from mainly from lower Medicaid and Obamacare costs, but we don't really know how or where that money is coming from. And without more detail, it's very challenging for us to score it. And so we did what CBO did, which is that for outside of the drug cost and surprise billing, we essentially assume that his healthcare plan costs and saves zero based on the level of detail, which itself would have zero cost or savings.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to do one final question, area we haven't talked about, foreign policy. President Ed writes in, what impact would leaving our entanglements in the Middle East have on our budget?
So both President Trump and Vice President Biden, using actually very similar languages, say they want to stop the endless wars and bring our troops home. There's an area of the budget devoted to the conflicts in Afghanistan and the Middle East called OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations. If you were to eliminate that starting next year, it would save about $750 billion. Now, we think that's pretty unrealistic that you could eliminate that because for two reasons. One, it's actually sort of plugging a little bit the rest of the defense budget. There's some cheating going on. But the other is that even if you put all our troops out, you would still probably want to keep some kind of presence. You want to protect the embassies, and you may want to provide training and things like that. And so we look to President Trump's budget on this, which would save about $550 billion by mostly eliminating that OCO. And we assume that both candidates would do that, essentially saving $500 billion over a decade. That's real money. That's big money, but that's not enough to pay for a $6 trillion or an $11 trillion agenda.
Thanks so much, Mark. I just want to remind folks, if you'd like to read the reports at crfb.org, it's incredibly detailed, incredibly sourced. So Mark, kudos to you and your team for doing it. We also encourage everyone to please, while you're there, check out our initiative, US Budget Watch 2020, for additional explainers. And as always, before we log off, thank you for joining us. We want to encourage you to make sure you vote on Election Day. And in the meantime, please stay well. And thank you again for joining. Thank you.